אז מה אני מאוד okay. Lots of tech stuff going on. That's good. Okay, so we're at lesson 4. And tonight we're going to talk about a very fascinating discussion. A discussion which I would say Judaism has very much changed the way the entire discussion takes place. Joining us, Beryl? Yeah. Sure? Okay. Has changed very much the way we look at these issues nowadays, and that's issues of personal freedom. We're going to look at some of these issues of personal freedom and then get an understanding how Judaism looks at them, and realize that even as far as things have come in the modern world from where they were, Jewish values still puts personal freedom in a certain sense even beyond where today the modern society puts it, which is, it's a fascinating discussion. Interesting discussion.
I'm already surprised.
You're ready to be surprised. Okay. And there will be things which, you know, we're going to expand our thinking about. That's what it's all about. Bezrat Hashem, that's the plan. So where we'll start with the short clip about an actual case which took place in 1857. And from there, that will launch us into the discussion. I'm going to use my computer to show you. Okay. So what do you guys think? Should one be given the free choice to be a slave or not?
It's a very difficult question.
Huh?
It's a very difficult question.
That's what we're asking you.
It's contemplated on the Torah that you can.
That's what we're going into the Torah's view on it.
Yeah, you can. So after the 7 years, you have the right to be freed. But if the slave wants to stay, then they do a very weird thing. So they pierce his ear, and he can stay.
Good, Jeremy. Excellent. You're right. There is a concept in the Torah of a slave who decides that he loves his master, and he says, I don't want to go free, because the Torah concept of slavery is a very interesting concept. We'll get to it a little bit later. I don't want to jump into that now. Let's save that for now. Let's deal with the question at hand now. So here's this lady. She is entitled to go free. She is free. And she basically says, I like my life in slavery. I want to be a slave. And the judge rules and says, just her free will, she can choose to be a slave. And that's what she does. She goes back to becoming a slave. Should free will extend to things like slavery? Or should we say at some point, slavery is not something that a person should be able to choose? That's something that's so corrupt, so against human dignity, liberty, that's even if someone wants it, they shouldn't be able to choose that. Okay? If you have anything you want to chime in with, chime in. Okay. How we're going to look at this question is really looking at it, generally speaking, try to understand what's freedom. Because that's a very important question. What right is there to freedom? And I just break that. That's a pity. And what right is there to freedom? And more importantly, once we're talking about free choice to become a slave. So what is the parameters of understanding what is freedom to say, okay, certain things free choice doesn't apply to because it's against what freedom stands for. What's that all about? Free choice, slave, it sounds like it was almost a contradiction. How does that work? So generally speaking, the concept of freedom is philosophers have tried to understand, at what point do we say that how does this liberty thing work? What is human liberty? What are its guidelines? So usually it's like this. There's two kinds of liberty. There's something called negative liberty and positive liberty. What does that mean? Two ways of looking at this concept of freedom. One way is I am free from any influence, from any outside influence in terms of coercing me in a certain decision. I am free to do as I wish, whenever I wish, that's called negative freedom. Negative freedom is I'm free from, often let's put it like that term, free from oppression, free from coercion, free from anything which would coerce me in a specific direction. So that's one. The second is like the guy's been released from jail, he's free from prison. The second concept of freedom is no. Freedom is, it's called positive liberty, which is a concept that it's not enough that a person is just or it's not about being free from coercion, or it's about person being free to live his life's purpose, to do the things that he wants to do, etc., etc. So even if a person got these two sides, is freedom all about I'm a slave to no man. I'm a slave to no man, I'm free. Or freedom two, positive freedom is I am my own master. I can pursue my own goals. I can pursue my own dreams. That's what freedom's about. Following these two sides? And it's an interesting philosophical thing. So the question now is, how do we apply that to this case? Let's take the case of Betty. She wants to be a slave. If freedom means I am free to do as I wish and no one can coerce me to do what I want to do, so then can a person choose to be a slave if they want to? If you're going to say that they can't, what are you inhibiting their freedom? You are inhibiting their freedom. You are basically saying you cannot. You're blocking their freedoms. Their freedoms mean they can do. No one is coercing them to do anything, and therefore a person can choose to be free. Where on the other side, if freedom two, positive freedom, well, that's an interesting thing. If someone feels, can a person really fulfill their purpose, their full potential in a state of being a slave? Remember, let's just bring, what does slavery mean? Slavery means you are a nothing, basically. You don't exist. You are a table in your master's house. You are a chair. You don't have an opinion. You don't have anything. You are purely property of your master. So does that seem to go together with the concept of a person being able to freedom to live their life's potential, etc., etc.? It doesn't seem to fit so well, unless you might say, in the case of Betty, that she felt kind of her life's potential was a slave. I don't know. It's an interesting thing. If someone feels they can only fulfill their life's potential as being a slave, if there's such a thing, they got nothing else to offer in life, then yeah.
But was there any financial kind of I guess she wanted to stay a slave because she had the house and
right.
fed, and she didn't have the means to live on her own. So being a slave had some advantages,
some perks for her.
Yeah.
So it's in the case we see that her family was living in Tennessee and she liked her master. So there was, for her, like you're saying, and for her going free might have meant she was a woman of color. Being free in Massachusetts, she might have been free, but she would have lived a miserable life. Right. So for her, she chose,
matter what her considerations were?
Does it matter? Okay, so that's the question. Should we take into account her considerations, or what is this? No one should be now. It's an interesting discussion, and really, it goes to the core of understanding what is freedom, and therefore should a person be able to choose it. Now, from a Jewish standpoint, freedom is a big discussion. How much of Judaism, you know how often we mention freedom? All the time, every day in prayers, right? One of the most central Jewish holidays is called Passover. And what does Passover celebrate? Freedom. And Chag Cherutenu, exactly, Zman Cherutenu. It's the festival of freedom. And we mention Passover and this exodus from Egypt constantly. In fact, the birth of our nation is called when we left Egypt. So it was, we were born. Now, just to point out something, we left Egypt. The call, Moses comes to Pharaoh and says, Pharaoh, what does he tell him? What does he tell Pharaoh?
Let my people go.
Let my people go. Now, the truth is, that's mid-sentence. Do you know how that sentence ends? Shalach et ami v'yavduni. Let my people go so that they shall serve me. That doesn't sound like freedom anymore. Let my people go, freedom, so that they shall serve me. That doesn't sound like freedom anymore. What happened yet? And we discover that Judaism's perspective of freedom is really, and Judaism's got a lot to teach about freedom, is really freedom from is part one of freedom. Freedom two is part two of freedom. Freedom one, first part of freedom is let my people go. Let my people go. These outside oppressions, the shackles that you're enslaving them has to go. You can't be enslaving them. You can't be inhibiting their freedoms. But now, so you've been released from slavery. And now what do you do with that freedom? Unless you have part two of slavery, of freedom, which is so that they shall serve me. What did that mean? That meant that the Jewish people were going on their way to receive the Torah, which was a blueprint for how they should live their most enhanced, purposeful life possible. That's what the Torah was. The Torah was a blueprint and a manual for living. So unless they just had stage one of freedom, they didn't get stage two of freedom, that ain't freedom in the Jewish perspective. That's really the combo of the two that comes together. That the person's on the one hand, not a slave to no man, and yet has the purpose and the meaning and the value of what life is about and a way to achieve that. That's Torah freedom. And specifically, even going further, we're talking about a way to achieve it was serving God, which is maximizing his potential in the fullest capacity, being able to be a servant to God and serve God and achieve spiritual connection. Okay, so far so good. Okay, so that's just to show you where you see it in the text in a very powerful way. Let's take a look at text 3. In page 108. Yeah? So no person is free except for those who occupy themselves with Torah. So again, if you just have a concept of positive freedom, you should go, you're free to explore your purpose. Who are you to tell someone what their purpose is? And maybe this guy feels his purpose is this, but when you understand that God put you on this world for a reason, and he gave you a purpose, and he gives you the Torah and says, here, go ahead and fulfill your purpose, live your life based on what you were put on this planet. God's giving you your purpose. So then now it's not up to you to just, say, okay, I want to be a slave. So what would we say based on Torah's, can Betty choose to be a slave? Is it possible for a person to really fulfill their purpose of what they were put on this planet to be able to serve God and be able to maximize their potential based on the Torah as a slave? The answer is absolutely no. And therefore, certain things aren't open for an option. You can't opt in to be. Let me ask you, can you commit suicide legally?
Legally, yes.
No.
No?
No, it's illegal to commit suicide. Huh?
You're taking life.
You're taking a life. So hold on a second. It's my life. Let me do whatever I want. So this brings us to a next point. There are certain things that inherent. What do I mean? If I'm going to talk about, freedom for this marker. Now, if I'm going to put this marker in a box, do you think this marker feels stifled? Does it inhibit its freedom? Now, let's say I'm going to take a plant, and the same thing, I'm going to put that plant in a box. Does it inhibit its freedom? No sunlight, no air. Will it inhibit the plant's freedom?
It will.
It will. What happens if I say now, I want plant, I want to make you free. I'm going to grab him and uproot him from the ground and throw it into the air and say, plant, you are now free. Is that freedom for a plant? No. However, the freedom which a plant needs, which is being rooted to one space, if you're going to do that same freedom for an animal, is that called freedom for an animal? I think the ultimate cruelty is like you talk about foods which are grown very cruel. You have like a veal or things like that, where the animal is literally tied up from the day it's born, so that it should just physically grow bigger and bigger, and it shouldn't be able to move around or anything, purely so that it should be more tender. That's the ultimate cruelty. You're taking a creature which is supposed to roam, which is supposed to enjoy being able to move around, and you're tying it up, and that's terrible. So what's freedom for a plant ain't freedom for a animal. And the same thing as we go into the human sphere. If we're going to just be, there's things which are inherent, what it means to be free for a human. What it means to be free for a human is that a human being has intellectual capacity. And if you deprive a human being of his intellectual capacity, you're denying him a basic right of what it means to be a human being. A basic humanity is being deprived of him. The same way if you would take an animal and put him in a box and you're depriving its inherent existence. The same thing is if you take a human being and you deprive him of some of the basic things of what a human being, his definition is, then you're depriving him of his own humanity. Right? Now, the Torah tells us that, let's just take a look at text 6, 110. Service of God is not something that stifles the identity of a Jew, God forbid. On the contrary, divine service is the very core of every Jew's being. This is the meaning of our sages' teaching, no person is free except for those who occupy themselves with Torah. Even though Torah observance is termed service, observing Torah and mitzvahs is the true nature of a Jew. As the mission teaches, I was created to serve my Creator. Only when serving God is a Jew truly free. Now, what are we seeing here? That from a Torah standpoint, a human being has his inherent definition, what it means to be human. And that's using your intellectual capacity, but going further, it actually means your ability to serve God, your ability to have a connection with your Creator. I think, the idea that just it's something I think it brings it out a lot. Each sphere within creation, inanimate, soil fuels plant life fuels animal life, and kind of transcends itself and breaks into an animal. Animal can be brought up to human life. Now, where does the human being kind of go and transcend himself? Where does his purpose lie? Where do we go? So I could be the best human being, but I haven't really transcended and broken out of what it means to be a human being. The same way soil broke out and became a plant, and plant broke out and became an animal broke out and can enter a human realm. So where does the human being go? And we have the unique ability to be the bridge to be able to connect to the divine. Finite to infinite. That's what's incredible about a human being, that we have an ability to connect to God. And that's not something foreign to us. That is our inherent humanity of what it means to be a human being. That's what God endowed us with, that ability, that depth of what it means to be a human being. So if I'm going to go ahead and turn around and say, you know what, I want to make a free choice. I want to make a free choice to not be a human being. Is that something you can choose? Is that you're using your free choice? It's the most unnatural choice. And it's an interesting thing because we're speaking about committing suicide, right? It's illegal to commit suicide. In society, it's understood that life is something that's inherent. You shouldn't be able to take your own life. You shouldn't be able to. That's something that's inherent, and in Jewish law, it actually works like this. If a person makes a decision to take his own life, often we say he wasn't doing that of sound mind, because it's impossible in sound mind. So we're talking about in 95% of the cases, impossible in sound mind to say I'm going to take my life. There is obviously at some level there was a coercion in this person's decision that made him say my life is not worth living, and he made that decision. Was that a completely sound decision? How could a person make a completely sound decision which goes inherently against what it means to be a human being? It means to be alive. How could he choose not to be alive? Okay, there are certain crazy situations, but normally, some level, there was some kind of mental illness, was some kind of pressure to such an extent that the person couldn't see it any other way. Was it of sound complete mind? No. What does that mean for us? Can a person make a free choice to be a slave? Being a slave, by definition, is against what it means to be a human being. A human being is not a slave to a person. That is something that could be for an animal or a human being. Is very humanity, demands not being a slave, demands being able to achieve what a human being's potential is, to connect to God and be able to use his unique human faculties. If I'm going to choose to not do that, that's not a proper choice. Does that make sense? It's a little bit of a subtle idea, but are we getting it? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Let's just look at some of these in the text, because I want you to look at, first of all, text 111. Anna, you want to read for us?
Slavery is an unnatural state. The natural order of the universe is that animals are under the domination of humans, but it is against the natural order of humans to be a slave to another human. Okay, so again, it's not that slavery is you've got a compromised freedom. Oh, what's slavery? Your freedom has been compromised. From a Jewish perspective, your humanity has been compromised. Your very definition of what it means to be human is that you are a free person, being able to live your life in your potential, and inherent in that is your ability to be free and not to be able to achieve your potential. And for a Jew, that means to be able to connect to God and to live his life in the fullest way. Yeah. So a free choice doesn't really apply here, because free choice, it's almost like an impossibility. You're choosing something which is out of touch of what it means to be you. So what you really, it's the greatest tragedy. Really what it means is you need to sit down with that person and say, you don't realize who you are. You don't realize what you've been created for. You have, and you need to work with that person. It's almost like the guy who thinks the only way out is suicide. Terrible. It's a catastrophe. It's the saddest thing. On the contrary, that person the value of life is beyond the struggles that he's going through, etc., etc. Got it? Okay. Now, yeah. So probably this Betty in the story hasn't had the chance yet to experience how it feels like to be a real human being.
Absolutely. What Betty, the judge, could have done and should have done, from a Jewish standpoint, is sit down with Betty and say, Betty, you've been placed on this world to be a human being, which means that you've got enormous potential, which can only be realized as a free person. As a slave, you're being deprived of what it means to be human.
You're living effectively an existence which is not in the human sphere. Go figure out your purpose in life. Torah tells you a purpose in life. You have a chance to go help people, etc., 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 and make meaning and purpose in your life. That would be what being human means. Yeah.
Maybe she has enjoyment in serving her masters.
Okay, so I think when we look at it like that, we don't realize what slavery really means.
So maybe this is fulfillment to her, to make someone else's life easier.
So but again, the concept of a slave, the way it really existed, is that this was something was completely, you don't exist anymore. So it's not like you're making a free choice to not exist. It's in a certain sense, you're committing suicide on your humanity. You understand?
Mm-hmm.
The whole concept of I want to make a difference and I want to be a slave, that doesn't, it's like, they don't go together. You're not making a difference by being a slave. Go work for the person, go help the person, go make money and do something. You can't, you're going to become a host now because I want to be the person's host. That doesn't make sense. You're a human being. You've got your talents, your abilities, what it means to be a human being. And your way of actually living out what that means is not by being a host. You've got to be a human being, and then you'll be able to be what it means. Does that make sense? Huh? Is it clear? Yeah? Okay. Just let's take a look at 108 and 109, because these are going to be the core principle here that really bring out this idea fully. 108. Tanel, you want to read?
Text 4.
Text 4, yeah.
The children of Israel belong to me as servants. They are my servants whom I brought out of Egypt. I am your God.
Okay. Continue text 5.
The children of Israel belong to me as servants. With this verse, God is saying they are my servants, not servants to other servants.
Okay. Avadai heim v'lo avadim la'avadim. Very interesting concept. God saying they're my servants. This is, so yes, we're God's servants, and that sense is how we, in Jewish perspective, that's the ultimate human capacity, is that being a servant to another servant is contradictory to what it means altogether, to being able to be, slavery is the opposite of what it means to be human. Yes.
So I think, continuing with what you just said about Hannah's question,
Good.
if Betty feels like carrying out her duties as slave is fulfilling her purpose here, then she can keep carrying out her duties, but not in the form of a slave.
Right, because as soon as you enter the slavery, so then there's no way out. That's the problem with slavery. You are no longer in a position to make a free choice about anything. You can, if you theoretically can engineer slavery according to your wills and desires, so then that wouldn't be slavery. But that's why the whole thing doesn't work.
So she's doing the same thing, but for a full-time salary.
But it doesn't work. She
as a job.
Once she's in, so that's it. There's no such thing. She can't quit. She can't say, I don't want this anymore. She can't say, I don't want, this is not my purpose. I see now that I've achieved what I can here, and now I want to achieve something further. That doesn't exist in her capacity. Right? Slavery. You're in. She happens to be getting a moment in her life now where she can be making the decision. This is critical point now. Are you going to tune in what it means to live a life of purpose and meaning? And this is really, I'm saying, we just came from the holiday of Shavuot. That's exactly what the holiday of Shavuot is. Step 1 of freedom is Passover. We then have a holiday 49 days later, and actually Shavuot's the only holiday on the calendar we spoke about, which doesn't have a set date because it's just part 2 of Exodus. That's part 2 of Exodus, which is experiencing the freedom 2 element of freedom, which is living a life of meaning, of potential, of purpose, which comes with the beginning of the Torah. And that's inherent within the individuals. That's what a human being is. Yeah? Okay. Without spending too much time on that, let's move on to the next part. So we got the value. The value is that in the Torah value of, there's a big problem with slavery. Slavery is inherently against your essence, your inherent nature. If it helps you to think about it in the context of suicide and what that means, then think about it like that. But there's certain things which we could say, this is not a choice. This is something that's inherent, and this is the way it is. You shouldn't be able to choose to opt out of that. Because this is who you are. This is what it means to be. To me, so if you want to say freedom means being within. It's a freedom of being. It's not a freedom from, it's not a freedom to, it's a freedom to be. To be a human being. That's what's something inherent, something deep. That's what took place in the leaving of Egypt. Okay? Okay. This brings us into a discussion. We're going to go through 3 cases, 3 understandings of Jewish law, and seeing how this value comes through within these things, like we've been doing throughout our course. The value, how it actually expresses itself within Jewish civil law. The first thing we're going to start with is repaying loans. Okay, so before we get into the case itself, they tell a story about this guy, Robert White. He's got this nice investment firm. He's starting up a new business, and he hiring lawyers. So this guy, Jack Greenfield, walks into his office. Jack, are you an honest lawyer? You know, this is an investment firm. We need lawyers with integrity. Can you tell me, are you an honest lawyer? Jack says, me, an honest lawyer. Most honest. Tell me an example of where you are honesty. He says, my father, I paid him every single penny of the $15,000 that he gave, £50,000 that he gave me for studies, uni. I paid him back. The first case that I tried, paid him right back. So he was impressed. He says, really, what was your first case? He says, my father sued me for the money. So you can be forced to pay your money back. That's exactly what, forcing to pay money back. Now, back in the day, there was 2 primary ways you were forced to pay money back. One was, there was something called debt bondage. Debt bondage meant you didn't have money to pay off your loan. Jeremy lent me $10,000. I don't have the money. So Jeremy says, okay, you have to go and work until you get that money, and then give me that money back. That's called debt bondage, forced labor. Now, let's take a look at this case here and see how this is looked at within Jewish law. So case study 8. What are we up to? Not the Jeremy, go for it.
Reuben borrowed money from Shimon and failed to repay the loan. Reuben is now living with a relative where he eats good food and dons expensive clothing. His wife is similarly expensively attired and even provides gifts to her friends. Reuben claims that all of this is provided by his relative, whereas he personally is penniless. He sits idle and refuses to engage in any labor or business of the type he always performed in the past, because he knows that any money he earns will necessarily go toward repaying his loan.
Okay. This was an actual case that came in front of Rabbi Osher ben Yechiel the Rosh. This is one of the great halachic Jewish law codifiers. We're talking about the period around, say his life thing exactly, 1250, 1328. Yeah. So that's the time that the Rosh lives, and this is a case that comes in front of him. What would you say? Can you make this fellow go and work? This Reuben, he's living, he's chilling, living the life, but he owes a big amount. Can you force him to go work? You have to get a job. Court should rule.
Assuming he is not disabled in any way. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So let's lay out the law first. Within Jewish law, returning a debt is an absolute biblical obligation. You have an obligation to return a debt, and you not only have an obligation to return a debt, every single thing you own except for your bare necessities for living, can be sold and can be confiscated, whatever it is, by the court, towards paying off your debts. Okay? Here you have it in text 8 from Maimonides. Scripture establishes, 115, Scripture establishes that when creditors demanded payments of debts and the debt's owned assets, the debtor's existential needs must be provided for, following which the remainder of debtor's assets are granted to the creditors. Okay, that's what we said. Now, what happens if you have no assets? So in the old days, this is the way it used to work, huh?
You were sold as a slave.
In the old days, I remember sold as a slave. I'm talking about, not necessarily, you weren't sold as a slave, but there was something called debt bondage. You were forced to work, or you were thrown into prison. It was two ways of dealing with it. It was called debt bondage or what's it called? Prison labor. Well, not so much prison labor, debt prison. Those were the two ways you were dealt with it. Now, does that work within Jewish law? Can you force someone to go and work to pay off the debts? Let's continue reading Maimonides. If the debtor owns no assets, or if their assets are only sufficient to provide for their existential needs, then nothing can be done for the debtors and they may not be imprisoned.
Wow.
And therefore, in text 9, look at the Rosh, which is his court ruling when this matter came to him. And Shimon was claiming, what can I do to Reuben? Shimon's request that Reuben work in order to repay his debt is not something that the court can compel. The court cannot extend its jurisdiction of Reuben's actual person by compelling him to work in order to repay his debt. The answer is, the reason is because to compel a person to work is another way of saying you can enslave a person. They're often looked at as equivalents. To make someone work is by definition, to force someone to work is by definition slavery. Now, these debt bondage was something which existed across the world. Till the 1850s in England, you were able to force someone to go and work to pay off a debt. That came to an end. There's no such thing as debt bondage. You all said, yes, that's not how it works, because society views that as a form of slavery. Together with slavery was the abolishment of a concept of forced labor. That's a form of slavery. Yes, it's not slavery in the sense that you own a person in that sense, but the person's entire achievements and everything, you are taking full control and you're forcing him to work, is an extension of slavery. Torah, based on the principle we saw, so careful to infringe on a person's freedom in terms of understanding how deep that freedom goes. Torah has always protected the concept. We just saw debt bondage. The Rosh tells us absolutely not. Can you put a guy in prison? What does Maimonides say? Absolutely not. Because that's, again, it's a form of forcing a person. If you say, if you don't pay me, you're going to be thrown into prison, you're forcing the person to give up his freedom for the purpose of paying up the loan. You're forcing a person into again, the whole concept of he's now being forced into which again is the same problem. Let's take a look how this works in the one exception, by the way, just interesting. The one exception in society, in Western society till today, of where the slavery concept still exists is, take a guess, where can you force someone to work?
Where?
Yeah.
In which country you mean?
Or which country, or not so much which country, in what situation can you force someone to work? Can you force someone to work?
To feed his kids.
To feed his kids, interesting. So in Torah law, there's actually is an idea that if a person has an obligation to his wife and family, you can force him to work. That's one of the exceptions. Part of the understanding there is that, yeah, that would be actually an exception to this general rule. Prison labor. Let's take a look at page 117, text 10. Once cleared by the prison doctor, inmates can be forced to work under the threat of punishment as severe as solitary confinement. Legally, this labor may be totally uncompensated. More typically, inmates are paid legally for their full-time work. How is this legal? Didn't the 13th Amendment, this is American law, abolish all forms of slavery and involuntary servitude in this country? So together with abolishment of slavery was involuntary servitude. That's a form of slavery. Not quite. In the shining promise of freedom, that was the 13th Amendment, the sharp exception was carved out. Neither slavery nor involuntary service, except as punishment for crime, is allowed. So incarcerated persons have no constitutional rights in this area and can be forced to work as punishment. That's the US law. I don't know if it's different here in the UK, but I don't know. The truth is, I don't know. But would that be allowed within Torah law? Answer is no. That would be something inherently that cannot be deprived from a person. This freedom, this human freedom, is so deep, is such a deep value that absolutely one can never be forced to work. And the specific situations, like you mentioned about a family, those are to do with his obligation and possibly a mitzvah, so therefore it's a different situation. But generally speaking, absolutely not.
Not exactly the subject of this lesson, but are there any rules in place that meant to protect lenders from lending money to someone who needs it?
If you can't do things like this. So
yeah, if I can't force him to pay me.
Okay, so how does it work nowadays? In Western, what normal?
You take a collateral.
Huh?
You take a collateral, you know?
Collateral, guarantors, this, that, you know. There's no concept of you can always declare bankruptcy, which is an interesting concept, and theoretically walk away and leave people's lives in shambles, which has happened. But the next thing is death prison, which was this wild idea. You've heard of Charles Dickens? In England, Charles Dickens was one of the greatest novelists. So Charles Dickens, in his writing, he writes a lot about concept of debt prisons. Debt prison basically was, didn't have money to pay. I threw you into prison. Now there's so many classic Jewish stories in the Eastern country where the guy had a little inn, and then the guy who owned the land, he didn't have money to pay the rents. He threw them into prison, and how they tried to get out of the prison, redeem them. There's all these stories about, but this is a debt prison. Charles Dickens writes about it so much. You know why? Because his father was someone who sat in prison because he couldn't pay up a loan. And Charles Dickens, as a 12-year-old boy, he got a job sticking labels to bottles so he should be able to try to pay off his father's debts. And it stuck with him so badly, this dignity, that the deep thing of his father's dignity being deprived of him, like having to go to death prison, that till he wrote about it throughout his life. And he actually ended up campaigning and was one of the reasons why they actually abolished death prisons in the UK. You could have gone to, in the UK, just to give you an understanding, text 11, page 118. The prisons were full of rats. I'm just going to skip to the middle paragraph. Full of rat, lice, and fleas. The prisoners were denied basic necessities of life, such as food, water, and clothing. It said these places were so dirty and filthy that around 25% of the inmates died due to these horrible living conditions. The debtors were imprisoned and tortured at the pleasure of the creditors. When other countries of Europe had legislation limiting the debt imprisonment term to 1 year, England did not have such a law. When in 1842 the Fleet prison was closed, it was found that debtors were there for almost 30 years. So here again, in Jewish law, you cannot create a situation where incarceration will be the guarantee for paying up a loan.
because, yeah,
And in which cases the court can sell a person to slavery to pay the debts?
if someone stole, if someone's, Jeremy's right, there is a concept in Jewish law. Now, first of all, we have the whole concept there in the Torah allows slavery. There were slaves in the Torah. So how did that work? So first of all, the whole concept of slavery in the Torah it wasn't nothing like slavery in the common sense. It was 6 years. Better. Yeah. It was 6 years, and then the 7th year he was let out free. It was he could have at any point redeemed himself from slavery and paid his way out of slavery. There's so many, the expression is so much to the point where it says that if the person, based on Torah law, got himself a slave, he was actually getting himself a master. Because he had so many things, the restrictions, the how and what, that it was so complicated. He had to be so careful about how he treated the slave that that was if the person sold himself into slavery. There was a time where the court was able to sell one time in a case where a person stole and he didn't have money to pay back the people he stole from, and the court was able to sell this person into slavery, to a slavery that we were talking about, which is anyways a quasi-con, wasn't like a full proper slavery. And in those situations where the court sold someone, so it was very interesting because it was actually part of a rehabilitation process in it's described how for the thief, part of his rehabilitation back into undoing all that he did was this concept, the slavery idea which he went into. But it was a very different in terms of what we're talking about. This kind of classic. This is slavery in the Torah wasn't even like what we just read about that prison. Very much different kind of feel. Okay, so far we've pushed aside. You can't do that bondage. Torah, that whole concept of you being forced to work doesn't. That's a form of slavery, and therefore it has never existed in Torah principle. Western societies, pretty much, even as I think at the back you have an appendix where you see, can you go into prison for not paying a debt? Page 132, just to take a quick look at when debt prisons came to an end in the world. So you have here dates, you see that? 1849, 1833, 1869, 1868. Greece, 2008. Oh, wow. So you were able to go to prison in Greece just because you had an outstanding debt. So again, you weren't being forced to work, you were just going to prison. This whole concept of debt prisons, of the undermining someone's freedom because of a debt. Now, interesting, this even goes further. And just taking a look at the next case that comes in front of the Rivash, text 12, 119. This is a case where they're in Aragon. Aragon, you know what that is? Jeremy? Huh?
Say that again.
Aragon.
Where that is? In Spain.
Spain. It's still a place called Aragon?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah?
It's
in
the
the
north.
region?
It's a region, yeah.
Okay, so it used to be, it used to be its own kingdom, right? The kingdom of Aragon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so here, this is hometown for you, right? So they're living in Aragon. The law in Aragon is, if a debtor does not own available assets from which his debt can be repaired, he can be incarcerated. Okay? Two Jews come to the Rivash, they make an agreement together. You're a Spanish Jew, I'm a Spanish Jew, and you, Jeremy, you're lending or you're borrowing? You're lending. I'm going to borrow from you, and I say, if you don't pay up, you could throw me into prison. And not only do they rely on the local Spanish law, that being the law, they put it in the contract
And they say if he doesn't pay up, he can throw me into, if I don't pay up, I could be thrown into prison. Well, guess what? I don't pay up. And now I came in front of the Rivash and take a look. Shimon, the creditor, now demands the repayment, second paragraph. But Reuben has no assets to pay. Shimon requests that Reuben be imprisoned, and as he explicitly agreed in advance. Reuben argues that he cannot be imprisoned for his debt because there is no precedent in Jewish law for a person to be imprisoned due to debt. He requested my opinion on the law in such a case. This was an actual case that comes to Rivash. What does the Rivash say? Jewish law sides with Reuben, the debtor. A person cannot consent to be incarcerated. The Torah states the children of Israel belong to me as servants, from which we derive that they cannot be made servants to other servants. No contract clause can allow for a person to be compelled to work, not even in his regular vocation. Goes without saying, no clause can allow for a person to be incarcerated and made to languish in a dark dungeon. So even though this was part of the contract, it would be overridden because it's against a fundamental principle within Judaism of the value of freedom. And that means you can't, it's not something you have the voluntary choice to give up.
In any case, the debt after 7 years expires, no?
That's Shemitah. Shemitah takes away debts, true, but there's something that you give the debts over to the Beth Din, so it doesn't have to expire. There is a way that, you make it a communal debt, and then it's called a prusible. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So in fact, it's a way to have.
Although anyway,
it's a way to have
right. So they
longer
enacted prusible because people weren't lending money. They were worried that they were going to constantly get their debts. So the prusible was an enactment allowing people to be able to extend their loans instead of a Shemitah coming always and just
because
smashing the loan down.
If you are at the end of the 6th year,
you're never going to lend.
Of course not.
Exactly. So he's bringing up there's a concept of a 7-year cycle, a sabbatical. You've heard of sabbatical? People go on sabbatical.
Yes.
So where is that? It's a Torah idea.
Every week.
Straight from the Torah. So that's Shabbat, right? And in the cycle of years, you have 7 days and you have 7 years. Every 7 years is a sabbatical year.
And then 49 years as well. No?
And then 49 years, and then you have the 50th, which is the Jubilee. Jubilee, we just had the Jubilee. Queen's Jubilee is the Torah idea again, straight out of the Torah. Yeah. Okay. Now we're going to go into one final discussion on this, which is all about workers' freedom. How does this work? How far does this go in terms of our current work arrangements? Does this impact even our current work arrangements? And we're going to discover that can you be compelled to work? Now, first of all, this is an interesting thing because nowadays, it's very in vogue, this discussion about how people being treated as employees, et cetera, right? Remember, it was not long ago, I saw an article about this guy in the States, I think, who literally died. He was like working for an investment bank or whatever it was. He died because he was working too hard. He was like literally overworked. Mashiach. And it's becoming more and more, there's the awareness of this. So the question here is, is there a concept of legally being able to force an employee to work? Or what's wrong?
No, fine.
Yeah, or is there limitations to that? How does this Torah value carry over to current work arrangements, contracts, and so on and so forth? Let's take a look at before we, I'll show it to you another tidbit where they told a story about this guy who's going with his grandson. And they're going through the cemetery. It's a certain kind of tour. You ever done the cemetery tour before?
Yeah.
Apparently, there's cemetery tours. You can go and you see, and instead of going to visit people, so you go for these
Shakespeare.
Right. And you go see all the tombstones. So I know you can hear the the Jewish cemetery here, you could do cemetery to us. Anyways, it's an interesting answer. But this guy, so he's walking with his grandson through the cemetery and he says, he points to their grave. He says, that grave is an honest man. He went straight to heaven. You know, I'm a businessman my whole life. He was a businessman. He worked his whole life to pay up the debt that he owed me. Then he only owed me 50 pounds. His whole life he worked to pay me back. That's an honest man, straight to heaven. Goes, carries on walking, sees another tombstone. Says this man, the worst of the worst. He went straight to hell. He owed so much money, not only to me, to everyone. He never made one drop of effort to straight to hell. His grandson turns around his grandfather. He says, grandfather, you're so lucky. Well, he says, no matter where you end up, you've got money to collect. Okay, so we're collecting money. So how does this work within the modern context? So Hannah, you want to read for us? Text 13 from the Talmud.
A worker has the right to withdraw from their employment even in the middle of the working day. This right emerges from the verse, the children of Israel belong to me as servants, whereby God is stating that they are my servants, not servants to other servants.
So you see that value coming through all the way through the literal civil laws. You see that value. It's fascinating. And this is an interesting thing. You can quit mid-contract. Now, that's pretty difficult because as an employer, to have someone converting mid-contract is not exactly a very pleasant thing. So let's go back to the case study, which we skipped at the beginning, and I want to read it now, which is on case study B, page 114. Natalia.
Mr. Britton signed a contract to work for Mr. Turner for 1 year, for which he would be paid $120 in total, equaling $10 per month. But Britton ceased working after 9 months, and Turner was only able to find a replacement worker for the remaining three months for $45, equaling $15 per month. Turner did not pay Britton anything for his uncompleted contract, and Britton sued to collect pay for work he performed.
Okay, continue.
How much do you think Mr. Britton should receive as a payment for his work? Select an option closest to your view. 0, 90, or 75?
Why would he get 0?
He didn't complete the contract.
He breached his contract. He was in the contract for 12 months. Why would he get 90?
Relative part for his work.
9 months, $10 a month. Why would he get 75?
Interesting.
Yeah, 9 months.
Oh, deducting his loss from the
He has to pay now 15, so 15 was lost to the employer, so he gives it back. Yeah, is that clear?
Yeah, he's a contractor, so.
He's an employee.
Also not a contractor, but an employee.
Employee.
It's different.
So he should have been entitled to 90, but he caused him now he needs to complete the work at 45. 15, therefore, is being lost to the employer. He only planned to pay 120, and therefore, that 15, the employee needs to take the loss, get 75.
I think the answer is 90, based on what we learned so
90. Okay, 0.
I would say 75 or 0.
75 or 0. Okay. This is an actual case. What do you say?
I don't know, it depends on their contractual terms. So whether there's a notice period, for example, like in a real job contract, you have 1 month to tell your employer that you're not going to work. In that case, you are entitled for your full pay.
Okay.
But
It seems that he was in breach of contract.
What if it was in the US? There is no notice in the US.
There's no notice.
Yeah, you can say, I quit, walk out the door.
And there's no penalty.
So dramatic.
Well, I guess the question is there penalty?
No,
Yeah,
not
but
that I'm aware, no.
if he's a
But you can be
contractor,
fired.
You could be fired. Okay. We're not talking about that. You don't want to quit. Yeah.
if he's a contractor, not an employee, then it will be a different story. I think.
Okay, interesting. Why? Why do you think that?
So if he's a contractor, then he signed up for delivering something for a certain amount of time. And in that case, I think the 75 would be the answer, because he needs to.
So you're saying a
In
contractor
employee.
should be dealt with more harshly than an employee?
It's not being
Yeah,
harshly, I
because
think.
if it's a contractor, it's not just a work per month, it's the whole project that counts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Contract
So,
is
for example, you contract a building company for one.
Good, good. Give me another difference between a contractor and an employee. Besides for how they're what's their relationship to the job as an employee and as a contractor? What's the relationship between them vis-a-vis the guy who gave them the job? As an employee, what's his relationship? He's an employer. As a contractor, what's his relationship vis-a-vis the guy gave him the job? He's a client. Is there a difference in that kind of relationship? Who has more control over who? An employee?
Employer.
Employer has more control over employee. A contractor is an independent man who has obligations towards him, but he's not under his jurisdiction in any way. Getting already where this might be going? Where is there more sensitivity to one needing to lose his freedom? And this can turn into a concept of possible breach of slavery in an employee or in the contract. An employee. And therefore, we're actually going to see that the way that this case is dealt with in Jewish law for an employee is different to a contractor. In addition to what you're saying, based on also the idea of how the necessity for avoiding possible breach of one's basic rights of what it means to be breached. Okay, so the starting principle is, in the Torah principle, you could always quit at any time. Why? The reason you could quit at any time is because you can't be forced to work. And therefore, you can't have a situation where you are locked into a contract and you're not allowed to quit. That is unallowed in Torah. Now, do you pay a price if you quit? That's really the case that we're just looking at. Mr. Britton, Mr. Turner, do you have to pay a price? So, let's take a look. Text 14. This is from Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, actually the son of the Rosh. We saw the Rosh before. This is one of the most famous halachic works. This is called the Torah. Who are we up to? Go for it.
An employee has a right to quit the job even in the middle of the day, and they are given the upper hand when calculating the pay they are entitled to receive. The quitting employee is entitled to payment for the value of work accomplished before quitting. This remains true even if the market rate for such work has since risen, leaving the employer unable to hire another worker to complete the job with the remainder of the funds. For example, an employee was hired for 8 dinars per day, but quit halfway to the first day, even if the cost of this particular form of labor has not risen to 12 dinars per day, so that the replacement worker for the second half of the day, which are 6 dinars, the quitting employee must still pay 4 dinars for the half day of work. We don't protect the employer from having to pay more than the 8 dinars they originally intended to pay by deducting the expense of the replacement workers from the quitting workers' pay, which would leave the latter with only 2 dinars.
Got it? Okay.
Mathematical exercise.
Mathematical exercise. You thought you were finished work.
It's not very fair for the employer.
Okay. So first things first is to realize that the employee has the right to quit, but in Jewish law, he's not looked at favorably for making that decision. He has an obligation, and therefore the employee can come to him with a claim, can come to him with what can be he's not viewed favorably for it, but he has the right to quit. And if he exercises that right, does he incur a penalty as a result? And we saw, no. He has the upper hand. There's the upper hand, the lower hand. Upper hand means he gets full restitution. full payment. Lower hand means he has to factor in the loss that he caused for the thing, and the employer gets the full thing. Yeah, he gets the upper hand. Now that there is a caveat to that, which is in the case in text 15, which page 123. Can anyone read?
If the work was time sensitive and its neglect would cause irreversible damage, the quitting employee has the lower hand in calculation of wages. For example, workers hired to remove flax from the water it was soaking in. If the flax is not punctually removed from the water, it will decay. If there are extenuating circumstances such as illness or the death of a family member, the employee has the right to quit while retaining the upper hand in the calculation of their wages. Absent such circumstances, the employee is given the lower hand when calculating their pay because quitting prematurely may cause the employer an irreversible loss.
Okay, see that? So, as long as there's going to be a financial penalty with the guy quitting, what essentially are you doing? You're essentially forcing him to remain in his job with a threat of incurring a financial, he's not going to walk out with all his money. There's that sensitivity towards his freedom being compromised. Torah says you can quit and get full payment. You'll have the upper hand. However, if your quitting is going to cause damage, what's the irreversible damage? That you are causing damage to the point where it's not just a question of, so if you're going to cause damage, then that damage you need to suffer the result. You're leaving mid-job and you're therefore causing damage, you need to take the loss. However, if you leaving mid-job just leaves the job unfinished, and now he needs to hire new workers and it's going to cost him more, that's the guy who's leaving, we say to the employer, okay, you can leave the job unfinished, it's your choice to complete the job. You pay the extra money. The employee has the right to leave and get his full payment. If him leaving causes you damage, then he has to incur that loss. So far, so good? Okay. The next thing takes us to this discussion of employee-employer. Employee versus contractor. Now, why would someone want to be a contractor? Versus for free. I'm not interested in having to get up this time in the morning, show up at the office at this time, and these are your holidays. I want to work for myself. You all know that, right? A contractor, the employee, what's the advantage of employee?
Security.
Job security. Anything else?
Holidays.
Paid holidays, right? It's part of your contract, which is part of, it's an element of job security too. So there's really this stability. You're a contractor, you don't know what's going to be tomorrow, you don't know if you're going to have work, you don't know employee, you get check, account, at least if you're working for a normal thing, every month, and you got that stability. But ultimately, as an employee, you're sacrificing some of your freedom for that stability. You're saying, I'd rather, and you could hear this from employees, I'd rather have someone telling me, show up at the office, than know that I have my money every month. I don't want the stress, I don't want the headache of having to think, maybe I want a business next month. I don't have that in me. I'd rather just the job, and I'll go, and I come home, and that's it, right? But, let's take a look now. Employees versus contractors, 125, text 16. Don't remember what we're up to. Matana.
The law granting an employee the right to quit does not extend to independent contractors. An employee is protected by the principle implied in the verse, they are my servant, not servant to other servants. But this does not apply to independent contractors, for the contractors serve only themselves.
Okay. Therefore, because there you see the same principle, the value coming through all the way again. Because when it comes to an employee, the employee's freedom needs to be protected. Therefore, the Torah doesn't want any coercion of this employee needing to have to stay in his job and be forced to stay in his job, because he already is his freedom needs to be protected, and therefore he can leave the job and he does not incur the loss. How much would he get? In the case of Mr. Britton, Mr. Turner, 90. However, if he was the contractor, if he had this job as a contractor, then that loss, which the employer suffers, he has to take that loss.
70.
And therefore you get 75. Because that principle safeguarding his freedom does not apply to a contract. That doesn't need that extra dimension of, so to speak, that protection. And therefore he's dealt with the lower hand. He said before, the higher hand, the lower hand, he's given the lower hand. The employer gets his full package, and you want to leave the job in the middle? Leave the job in the middle, but I'm not suffering the loss. You are going to pay for that loss. Interesting. So how did it actually work out in American law? That was an American case. In American law, this was a concept of an employee. American law, this was actually, which is still the law today, even though it was an old case. It was in 1834, but that's what's cool about law. You see the historical precedents. The employee actually gets the lower hand in law, at least the way in the United States. In Torah law, it would not work that way. The employee actually gets the higher hand, which is tough on the employer, but to protect that, safeguard that value of the freedom and what we're appreciating, what that personal freedom means in the Torah's value, it has to be safeguarded, and therefore he has to get that back. Okay, let's just wrap up all this discussion. And wrapping up the discussion, we'll take it to a little bit of a place of a little bit more of a abstract concept of freedom. And this is a beautiful poem from Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi. Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi was the great poet, great philosopher. So if we want to talk about this concept of freedom, we've so far seen that in Torah, the concept of freedom goes beyond secular approach to freedom. First of all, there was never a concept of debt bondage, debt prison in Torah, while there was within secular societies, because from the day the Torah was given to us, freedom was an inherent value. This was something that could not be compromised, and therefore, from day one, these concepts didn't exist, things which would inherently amount to slavery. Even though today, thank God, the world's come a long way and Western values see the same thing, even so, in certain areas like we saw, Torah is still even further in terms of safeguarding those personal freedoms than Western values. Where interesting is what we'll see now from Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, that there's a concept in Judaism, not only you should be free from any person, you should be free from anything. And it really ties back to what we started at the beginning of the class. Let's take a look at the poem, text 17. I think it's in unit for now. Is it? Mm-hmm. So we're at 126.
Servants of time are servants of servants. The servant of God alone is free. Therefore, when each person seeks their portion, my portion is God, says my soul from me.
Okay. This is servants of time. What does it mean, servants of time?
As an employee, as an employee, you are paid for your sacrificing your time.
Okay. Good. Yeah, absolutely. There's a very literal time that you have to be there, and your limitations in terms of time. What other in metaphoric time, servants of time? What else could it mean? Yehuda HaLevi is saying that a servants of time are servants of servants, which we already saw what that meant. The servant of God alone is free. I think you could say something to think about, but servants of time, how many things are temporary? How many things are, I need to dress this way because people are, this is the fad, and this is what's accepted now, and this is what's popular trends or popular opinion. I'm a servant of God. I'm not really, and it's so easy for us to fall into a certain kind of slave mentality, slave to our even our own passions. Yes, sometimes it's something that controls us instead of us control, and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is saying that ultimately this idea, servant of God alone is free, because in Judaism, this value of freedom is something which is very deep, it's a concept of being able to express the deepest part of what you have within you, which is a soul, and that connection that wants to experience, and you have within you something that's very deep. So really being able to express yourself and not be bound to what's this one to say, but to be truest to what your core is, that is the ultimate expression of freedom within Judaism. And you could just something to think about this exercise 4.3, think about throughout the week, something to think about where we may be just going back to that idea where the tears within creation were created here. We can be the bridge to the divine. We can be the ones, uniquely human ability, where we can reach our fullest potential, not just by being human, but actually kind of breaking out of that and being able to reach into the divine, which is something which is a mind expanding idea. So it's a wild idea, but something that's uniquely human. And that's, in a certain sense, when we can experience the greatest liberty and freedom, is when we do connect to something which is way beyond us, when we transcend our inherent humanness to experience something which is way beyond us, which is within our human ability. That's connection to God. So I think that wraps up the discussion. Next week, we're going to discuss ownership, how that works, and what is our relationship with our things and our understanding of all of that. Fascinating discussion. Be here same time next week. Have a wonderful evening. Any questions we can please share them.
Interesting what you said about having a passion